and welcome to this week's video, this week's review. And we have a hi-fi review for you, a pair of powered speakers again. Now, if you remember, it wasn't last week, week before last, I'll put a little link up yonder if you missed it. I recently reviewed a pair of powered speakers from the French outfit, Triangle it was. They were priced, depending on the finish, £439 or £479, and they stand as a valid option if you're looking to upgrade your lower cost Kantos or Audiophiles or any of those powered designs. But I have to say, Triangle is not the only game in town. It's not the only solution or proposed solution in terms of upgrading lower cost powered speakers. There are others, and one of them is Airpulse. Now, Airpulse competes directly with Triangle for that upgrade choice. Now, to put Airpulse itself into context, the brand itself does have a distinguished heritage. The umbrella company, Platinum Audio Systems, was formed by a certain London-born Phil Jones back in 2004. Now, some of you may know Jones as the founder of the original acoustic energy speaker company back in 1987, that would have been. And I mentioned upgrading the Kantos and Audiophile powered speaker designs. Well, Airpulse, since then, does have a financial connection with Audiophile because Audiophile has invested in Airpulse. So there's an actual business link between the two companies. And so the company Airpulse knows its powered speakers and, by association, the powered speakers market. Sure, the A80 design I'm going to be looking at in this video is a tad more expensive than the Triangle Elaras that I reviewed, but the A80 designs do provide, well, they provide a little bit of luxury, I suppose you would call it. The luxury arrives as a pair of horn-loaded ribbon tweeters as standard. That addition, that ribbon tweeter installation, well, that's a real surprise and a half, I have to say. I never expected to see such a refined component in a powered speaker. Now, before we get too techie, I think we should take a closer look. Now, powered speakers are often built to a price because they attempt to squeeze a lot into a small space for a low price. The addition of the ribbon tweeter puts you on alert that the A80 wants to be seen as a class above all of that. So what of the A80 speakers themselves? Well, they're nicely compact, actually. They span 140 millimeters by 250 by 220 millimeters, which means they will fit just about anywhere in a small bedroom, a bedsit, an office, kitchen, or even a garage. The A80s follow the usual master-slave format in that one speaker has all the power sockets and all of the controls, and the slave, well, that's just a sort of dumb passive speaker. The tweeters have already been discussed to some extent, but looking a little bit further below the rest of the build and the connectivity, you will find a pair of 115 millimeter, that's what, 5-inch mid-bass units, and they offer a hard anodized aluminium alloy cone suspended in a heavy, ultra-rigid cast magnesium alloy frame. Inside, besides the Class D amplifier, which powers this pairing, you'll find pyramid soundproofing foam. in the cabinet. This is there to reduce resonance, while at the rear is a rather unusual but rather pretty oval bass vent tube. Internal connections use branded transparent cabling from the USA. The cabinet itself is made from 18mm MDF, finished in walnut, and that looks very presentable indeed. On the rear is a gamut of connections. You've got two sets of RCA inputs labelled auxiliary and PC. You've got a USB port, optical, Bluetooth 5.0 is available for streaming, and that arrives with aptX. A sub-out port is available for those who crave more bass. Also on the rear is a rocker power switch, plus you get tone controls, bass and treble, plus you also get a volume knob. Now the A80 is controlled by a pebble-shaped remote control. Look after this little pebble-shaped remote control, because there's no other way to select your source. The remote itself is a low-cost unit made from plastic. Now, I expected a better quality unit for the price of this package, but aesthetically, well, in those terms, the remote itself still manages to keep a sense of style about it. Now, before we go any further, I just want to comment briefly on the installation of the remote control itself. You know, this first point in the review, it might seem silly, rather trivial, you might say. Yes, it's a critical part of the design, especially when you're looking at a lifestyle product like a pair of these powered speakers. If you're targeting a product at a general audience, the last thing you want to do is to annoy them because of pernickety design issues. And I certainly had that when I wanted to put the battery in the remote control. The battery being one of those button type affairs. Now, Airpulse had very nicely already put a battery in the remote control, but the thing had died, which is fine, it happens. Now, the company had kindly supplied a spare, which was great. As it was, I'm glad the battery died, because I may have missed this issue otherwise. It's such a basic task, but the battery door is unnecessarily keyed to attach itself in a particular way to the rest of the remote. When I say keyed, I mean that the door will only slot into the rear of the remote in one particular way. You push the door into the specific slots, and then you twist to lock that door using a spare coin. Even that shouldn't be a problem, but that keying arrangement is not particularly obvious. Position the tiny battery door incorrectly on the rear of the remote, which it's very easy to do, and it will just not fit. What's the point of keying a battery door, you ask? Well, I really don't know. After all, you put this door in the back of the remote and you twist it so you're locking it, so that should secure it. And isn't that enough? Now, even when correctly positioned, I found that I had to apply even pressure on this battery door to allow it to swivel clockwise to lock in the first place. Now, look, I've been in the hi-fi business for many years, shall we say, but even I wrestled with this blasted battery door for 15 rather irritating minutes. So instead of getting on with this review, I actually had to walk away for a quick coffee while I grumbled to myself for half an hour. But enough of these irritations. How do these speakers actually sound? And welcome back to the sound quality tests for the Airpulse A80 powered speakers. Now, I began by plugging in my modded Astel & Kern AK120 digital audio player into the rear of the A80s via the optical port. I plugged in my AK120 into the master speaker, and I must report that the security of this connection wasn't the best. The plug did not click firmly home. It sort of sat in the socket rather limply. When nudged, the plug itself wobbled, especially when compared to the competing powered speakers I was also using in this test from Kanto and from Triangle. On more than one occasion, I lost a signal because the optical plug moved in its socket ever so slightly, or rather, more than slightly. I had to be careful, otherwise the plug rocked to and fro like a child on a swing. I actually thought at one point that the socket itself was broken, but on closer inspection with a rather powerful magnifying glass, I found it was actually fine. And the problem is actually this: the socket is made for a bundled, cheap and nasty optical cable that comes in the box. This is one of those cables I wouldn't actually use to tie my shoes with. Now, if you have aspirations of upgrading your optical cable to something like a not exactly fancy QED model, which is an upgrade, but I wouldn't call it exorbitant or overly high-end in price terms, then the socket can't handle the rather more, well, the larger, more robust third-party termination. The socket on the Triangle speakers, for comparison, was fine. That took the QED with no problems. Even the socket on the cheaper Kanto powered speakers, that was fine. Not a problem with those either. Plug it into the A80 though, and yeah. So in sound terms then, once the optical is connected, what does it sound like? Well, once the optical cable was finally in, I played Bob Marley's Get Up Stand Up at 24-bit 96K, mixing a typical reggae beat, percussion, secondary percussion, lead and rhythm guitar, organ, and a whole lot more. A busy soundstage, in other words. Starting from the bottom of the frequency spectrum, when compared to the Kanto YU4 speakers, the A80 designs, well, they offered a more mature and complex suite of bass frequencies. The bass, well, that sounded relatively organic. There was a real confidence in this area, which had the bass rolling around the bass guitar in a warming, melodic fashion. Now, further up the spectrum, the vocals around the mid-range provided an extra sense of emotion that made their performance quite engaging. They made you want to listen, in effect. I was a little disappointed, however, that the slight mid-range edge that I was hearing on the YU4s did remain on the A80s. Now, I was expecting more from the upper mid-range in terms of detail and insight. Especially, let me remind you, I had a pair of ribbon tweeters sitting in front of me, but the ribbons never really got going. If you told me that I was in fact listening to a pair of, I don't know, soft domed tweeters, let's say the source fitted to the Kanto YU4s, then I wouldn't have argued. I'd have thought I was listening to them. But I wasn't. I was listening to some rather expensive ribbons. Both upper mid-range and treble performance on the A80s was, well, it was fine, but it never really wowed. There was no real finesse or elegance here. The improvements from the A80s were there, sure, and I appreciated those improvements, but I wanted more, especially for the featured technologies and the basic price of these speakers. Moving on, I did note that the lower cost Triangle Elara speakers, well, they offered none of that accentuated mid-range edge that I was hearing on the A80s. The Triangle Elaras also produced a superior instrumental separation, so there was more space and air in between instruments. The Airpulse A80s, they seem to struggle to control the soundstage in comparison. Despite the sonic highlights around the bass and the mid-range, the A80s did toil a little to maintain frequency discipline. Properly controlling the mids and the treble was a bit of a trial for the A80s, while, to repeat, the benefits of having a ribbon tweeter in the cabinets, well, they were lost to my ears. But look, maybe the problem was the optical source. Maybe that was the issue, and that wobbly cable, hey. Maybe other sources would be a better bet, and maybe the performance would improve overall. So I selected Bluetooth just to see what happened. Via Bluetooth, I played Nina Simone and the track Love Me or Leave Me as a lossy file from my phone to see how the speakers coped with an inferior source signal, that lossy file. A challenge, in other words. The mids and the treble had that typical old-fashioned Bluetooth harshness, which I'm rather used to in presentational terms. That is, mid-range sounded a little thin and weedy, while the treble lacked depth or any sense of fragility. Now, I must add that the triangle Elara speakers did not suffer in the same way. The triangles offered fragility in the treble and provided more clarity and transparency in the mid-range. Saying that, the A80 speakers did give the piano focus and precision that added to the pace of the music. There was a sense of drive here that added a real finger-clicking rhythm to the song, but information was also lacking. I wanted the upper mids to be extended. I wanted to be aware of the subtleties of this piece, the vocal nuances and the extended reverb tails from the percussive cymbals, but I didn't hear any of that from the A80s. Even so, the A80s did provide a rather wide soundstage. The A80s were never crowded, and they never struggled to get the music to the ear. There was always a rather grand and rather striking presentation here. I just wish the quality of the music itself was of a similar standard. And on that note, I moved to vinyl. Firstly, I grabbed the rather dinky Lima Elements phono amplifier and I plugged that into the RCA inputs on the rear of the A80s to play vinyl via my Project Primary E turntable. And I put a copy of Jethro Tull's Living in the Past album and I ran with that. And would you believe it, but the performance from vinyl was oh so much better, far improved over the optical and the Bluetooth play. The output from this vinyl source was much more neutral and balanced, with none of the optical's clinical mid-range and weedy treble, and none of the undisciplined upper frequencies from Bluetooth. Sure, the sound quality wasn't exactly thrilling, or on the hysterical side of amazing. This is a powered speaker after all, let's not forget that. But it did provide far more cohesion overall. This I could listen to. So how do I conclude the review of the Airpulse A80 powered speakers? Also, what pros and cons should I give to this speaker? And what's going to be the final rating? So, what's going on here? Well, the sonic result is partly down to the nature of the powered speaker itself. You stuff a gamut of electronics in a box that vibrates like crazy and is drowning in high-frequency noise, and see what you get. But then again, the triangle Elara speakers, well, they sound so much better and for a lower price. So, it can't all be that then, can it? So what else is there then? Well, my guess is that the quality of the parts in the A80 design, I'm guessing some of those parts are struggling to cope. While the RCA inputs seem to perform fine with vinyl, and of course the A80s are being aided by all that external technology. You've got the turntable, which is external, you've got the phono amplifier, which is external, all good quality parts per se. And all that helps the speakers to improve in sonic terms. On the negative side, well, you've got that wobbly optical port connection and the sound output from the same, and that's front and center. You've also got the rather clinical Bluetooth output, and that's another piece of evidence. Maybe how the parts are integrated into the cabinet. Maybe that's part of the issue. Maybe the cabinet design itself doesn't help. I don't know. Maybe the chosen built-in amplifier can't hack it. It's a possibility. Whatever the specific reason, the Airpulse A80's internal parts are letting the rest of the speaker down. Give it some quality external parts like a decent turntable and a good quality external phono amplifier, and you immediately hear sound improvements. Now, that can't be a coincidence, surely. In short, the Airpulse A80 is overpriced, it's fiddly to use, and in sound terms, well, it's good in parts. The problem is, there are not enough of those parts. So let's get to the pros and cons, shall we? On the good side, well, we have the feature set. The A80s are packed with features, and that's a great thing. I liked the bass, which was quite mature. I liked the soundstage, which was rather impressively broad. In terms of size, you can put these speakers anywhere, so I liked the small footprint. That was a real plus point for a pair of powered speakers. Moving to the cons, and in the bad column, we have overall the parts quality, if you add up all of those issues I've listed in this review. There's the ribbon tweeter, which is pretty much AWOL. You're not really hearing it. It's not doing its thing. You're paying a lot of money for the ribbon tweeter. That's the headline. That's the star attraction, and it's nowhere to be seen or heard. The edgy mids are, well, rather too clinical for comfort. Then there's the remote control and those rather strange battery door issues I had. And then you look at the price and you think, I'm paying all of this money for all of these issues? And then you start to frown, and that's the reason that I'm going to give the Airpulse A80s a 5 out of 10 rating. And that's it, folks. Thank you very much for sticking with me to the end of this video. And if I could ask you perhaps if you'd like to cast your eyes beyond and below the video window and just give that likes button a nudge. And while you're there, if you could do the same for the subscribe button, I'd much appreciate it. Also look down below for the chapter headings. If you want to navigate around this video, you can do that because there's all kinds of chapter headings down there, so you can skip bits you want to skip. Also, there are all kinds of links to my social media platforms that I reside within. There's a Facebook group I run, which you're welcome to join. There's my website, which has all kinds of stuff there, which you won't find here. And there's my Patreon page. And don't forget, I have done a second Patreon preview, which looks at a possible forthcoming review, a Technics amplifier. It's a bit of a unboxing, I suppose. I look at the box itself, and the box itself has a point or two I make. Can I say more? No, I can't. It's in the actual review itself, but the box itself makes a star appearance. And I look here and there, over and yon, around and about the actual amplifier itself, and make a few comments along the way. So check that out. That's a Patreon exclusive. It's called Patreon Previews, and there's a couple of those on the Patreon page, and there's more to come. Anyway, I will be back on Tuneful Tuesday, and we have another music magazine. We've got book reviews. I think we have 2 this time. 2 book reviews, and there's some CD reviews, and there's a whole heap of vinyl news. So I hope to see you then. Love to have your company, and until then, folks, bye-bye for now.